The train conductor punched my ticket and said, "Get off at the next stop. Don't ask questions, just go." Tom Brennan's hands were shaking as he handed me back my ticket, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning that kept the passenger car at a comfortable 72 degrees. I'd been riding the Colorado Mountain Express to Denver for 3 years, every month for the Torino case depositions, and Tom had never looked at me with that kind of desperate fear before. "Is everything all right?" I asked, noting the way his eyes kept darting toward the other passengers in the business class car. 3 men in expensive suits, all carrying identical leather briefcases, all reading newspapers with the concentrated attention of people trying very hard to look normal. "Please, Mr. Castellanos," Tom whispered, his voice barely audible over the rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails as we climbed through the Rocky Mountains. "Trust me on this. Get off at Glenwood Springs. Take the next train tomorrow." I studied his face, looking for signs of the kind of breakdown that sometimes hit railroad employees after too many years of dealing with demanding passengers and impossible schedules. But Tom's fear seemed specific, focused, the kind that came from knowing something terrible was about to happen and being powerless to prevent it. "Tom, I can't miss this hearing. The Torino trial starts Monday, and if I'm not there to testify about the financial records, Vincent walks free." I kept my voice low, but firm. "This is the biggest organized crime case in Colorado history." Tom's expression crumpled, and for a moment I thought he might break down completely. "Then God help us all," he muttered, and walked quickly toward the front of the car, his conductor's uniform rumpled and his stride unsteady. I settled back into my seat, trying to focus on the legal briefs spread across my fold-down table. As a forensic accountant, I'd spent 18 months tracing Vincent Torino's money laundering operations through offshore accounts and shell companies. The evidence I'd uncovered would put him away for life, along with half the organized crime families in the western United States. The train curved through a particularly scenic section of canyon, and I glanced up from my work to admire the view. That's when I noticed the 3 men in suits weren't reading their newspapers anymore. They were all looking at me with the kind of professional assessment that made my blood run cold. The man nearest to me folded his paper and stood up, adjusting his jacket in a way that revealed the shoulder holster underneath. He was tall, lean, with the kind of pale complexion that suggested he spent most of his time indoors. His companions remained seated, but their posture had shifted to something more alert, more predatory. "Mr. Castellanos," the tall man said, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place immediately. "We need to discuss some irregularities in your testimony preparation." I didn't recognize him from the prosecution team, and federal prosecutors didn't make house calls on moving trains. "I'm sorry. Who are you?" I asked, my hand moving instinctively toward my phone to call my contact at the FBI field office. "Someone who represents interests that would prefer certain financial records remain confidential." He sat down across from me without invitation, his pale eyes never leaving my face. "We understand you've been very thorough in your investigation of Mr. Torino's business affairs." The train began to slow as we approached what should have been a straight section of track, and I could hear the conductor announcing an unscheduled stop due to a medical emergency. But the way the tall man smiled when he heard the announcement told me this wasn't a coincidence. "What kind of medical emergency?" I asked, though I was already starting to understand that Tom's warning had been about more than just missing my court date. That's when the other passengers started collapsing. It happened simultaneously, like someone had flipped a switch. The elderly woman reading a romance novel 2 rows ahead simply slumped forward, her book falling to the floor. A businessman working on his laptop stopped typing mid-sentence and toppled sideways into the aisle. A young mother holding her infant daughter collapsed backward, the baby crying as it fell from her limp arms. The 3 men in suits were unaffected. They sat calmly in their seats while chaos erupted around them, small respirator masks now covering their faces. The tall man across from me pulled out a tablet and began taking notes, like he was documenting the effects of whatever chemical agent they'd released into the car's ventilation system. "Fascinating, isn't it?" he said, his voice muffled by the mask but still clearly audible. "Neurological agent, completely odorless, affects the respiratory system within seconds. We've been refining the formula for months." I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't support my weight. The briefcase on my lap felt like it weighed 100 pounds, and my vision was starting to blur around the edges. Whatever they'd pumped into the air was fast-acting and probably lethal in the concentrations they were using. "The financial records you've compiled are quite comprehensive," the tall man continued, flipping through documents on his tablet. "Shell companies in the Cayman Islands, cryptocurrency transfers, real estate purchases through proxy buyers, very impressive detective work." My phone slipped from my numb fingers and clattered to the floor. The baby was still crying, but weaker now, and I could see that her mother wasn't breathing at all. This wasn't just about silencing me. They were murdering an entire train car full of innocent people to make sure there were no witnesses. "Unfortunately, your testimony would create significant problems for our associates. Mr. Torino's organization provides valuable services to certain government agencies, services that require a degree of operational flexibility that wouldn't survive public scrutiny." The train had stopped completely now, and through the windows I could see figures in hazmat suits approaching from both directions. Not emergency responders, but a cleanup crew designed to make this look like an accident or natural disaster. Food poisoning, maybe, or a gas leak from the train's heating system. That's when Tom reappeared, but he wasn't wearing a conductor's uniform anymore. He was dressed in tactical gear and carrying what looked like military-grade breathing apparatus. "Agent Castellanos," he said, pulling the emergency oxygen mask from the ceiling above my seat. "Try to stay conscious. We need to move you now." "Agent?" I managed to wheeze out as he fitted the mask over my face and began dragging me toward the rear of the car. The oxygen was helping, but my limbs still felt like they were made of lead. "FBI, undercover for 8 months. We knew they were planning to eliminate the Torino witnesses, but we didn't expect them to gas an entire train car." Tom was strong, stronger than his slight frame suggested, and he was moving with professional efficiency. "Can you walk?" I nodded, though walking felt more like controlled falling. Tom guided me through the connecting door into the next car, which was filled with normal, healthy passengers who had no idea what had just happened 20 feet behind them. The contrast was surreal and horrifying. "The other witnesses," I gasped, thinking about the 3 men in business suits who'd been on the train with me. "Are they dead?" Tom confirmed grimly. "Robert Chen, Marcus Santos, and David Morrison, all scheduled to testify next week, all eliminated within the past 10 minutes. He was leading me toward what appeared to be a service door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." The implications hit me like cold water. I wasn't the only target on this train. Vincent Torino's people had systematically identified and murdered everyone who could testify against him, using the train's ventilation system as a delivery method for chemical weapons that would make the deaths look like tragic accidents. "How did you know?" I asked, as Tom opened the service door with a key card I hadn't seen him produce. "How did you know to warn me?" "Because I helped plan the operation," Tom replied, and his words made my blood freeze despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "I've been undercover in Torino's organization for 3 years, and when they told me to eliminate the witnesses on today's train, I realized I couldn't go through with it. We were in a service corridor now, narrow and poorly lit, filled with the mechanical sounds of the train's operating systems. Tom was moving fast, but I could hear voices behind us, people coordinating search procedures with military precision. The cleanup crew had discovered that 1 witness was missing from their body count. 3 years undercover," I repeated, trying to process what Tom had told me. "That means you've been murdering people for Vincent Torino, yes?" Tom's voice carried a weight of guilt that suggested he'd crossed lines no law enforcement officer should ever cross. 18 witnesses eliminated over the past 3 years, all made to look like accidents, natural deaths, or random crimes. The service corridor led to what appeared to be the train's engine compartment, where the noise was deafening and the air thick with diesel fumes. Tom handed me a second breathing mask and began checking gauges and controls with the familiarity of someone who knew exactly how the train operated. "Tom, we need to contact the FBI. Get back up. Stop this train before they kill more people." I was thinking about the passengers in the other cars, unaware that they were sharing a train with professional killers who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate witnesses. "I am FBI," Tom reminded me, "and the agents who were supposed to coordinate this operation haven't responded to any of my communications for the past 6 hours. Either they're dead, or they're compromised, or both." He was right, and the implications were terrifying. If the FBI task force investigating Vincent Torino had been infiltrated or eliminated, then we were completely on our own against an organization with unlimited resources and no moral constraints on their methods. "The train isn't stopping," Tom continued, monitoring instruments I couldn't read. "Captain Mills is in Torino's pocket, has been for years. He's taking us to a predetermined location where they can dispose of all the evidence and witnesses simultaneously." Captain Mills was the engineer, a man I'd exchanged pleasantries with during previous trips. The idea that he'd been planning mass murder while discussing the weather and mountain scenery was nauseating, but it explained why the train had deviated from its normal schedule. "Where are they taking us?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Abandoned mining operation outside of Aspen. Remote location, furnace facilities for complete incineration of evidence. They've used it before for body disposal." Tom's clinical description couldn't hide the horror of what he was describing. The voices in the service corridor were getting closer, and I could hear them coordinating with Captain Mills over radio communications. They'd figured out which direction we'd gone, and they were moving to cut off our escape routes. "There's something else," Tom said, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "The Torino case isn't just about money laundering. Vincent has been providing assassination services to foreign governments, using his organization to eliminate American citizens who posed threats to hostile intelligence operations." That revelation hit me like a physical blow. If Tom was telling the truth, then Vincent Torino wasn't just a crime boss. He was a traitor who'd been murdering Americans on behalf of foreign enemies. The financial records I'd uncovered were just the surface layer of a much deeper conspiracy. "Which governments?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew some of the answers. "Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. Anyone willing to pay for the elimination of American intelligence officers, military personnel, or government officials who got too close to their operations on American soil." Tom was checking his weapon now, a compact automatic that looked designed for close-quarters combat. The service corridor behind us erupted in gunfire as the cleanup crew began shooting through the door we'd entered. They weren't trying to take us alive anymore, which meant they'd decided that controlling the narrative was more important than interrogating witnesses. "This way," Tom said, opening another service door that led to an external platform between train cars. The wind was fierce at this altitude and speed, and the platform was barely wide enough for one person. Below us, the Rocky Mountains stretched out in every direction, beautiful and utterly unforgiving. I followed Tom across the platform, fighting against the wind and the train's motion, while trying not to look down at the 1,000-foot drop on either side of the railway bridge we were crossing. Behind us, the service door opened, and armed figures began firing in our direction. The next car was a dining car, filled with passengers enjoying lunch and completely unaware of the life-and-death struggle happening just outside their windows. Tom and I burst through the rear entrance, causing diners to look up in surprise and concern. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tom announced, his FBI credentials now visible on his tactical vest, "this is a federal emergency. Everyone needs to move to the front of the train immediately. Do not panic, but move quickly and follow my instructions." The response was predictably chaotic, but Tom's authority and obvious law enforcement equipment motivated people to comply. Families gathered their belongings and began moving toward the front of the car, while Tom and I positioned ourselves to defend against the armed figures pursuing us. "How many of them are there?" I asked, checking the ammunition in the backup weapon Tom had given me. I'd never shot anyone before, but the memory of that baby crying as her mother died was enough to overcome any moral hesitations. "At least 12 on the train, plus Captain Mills and whatever crew members they've compromised. Maybe more joining us at the mining facility." Tom was checking sight lines through the car's windows, looking for tactical advantages. "They're professionals, probably former military or intelligence." The dining car's rear door exploded inward as the cleanup crew detonated breaching charges, filling the space with smoke and debris. Tom and I returned fire while using overturned tables for cover, but we were outgunned and outnumbered by adversaries with superior equipment and training. "The next car forward is passenger seating," Tom shouted over the gunfire. "Families with children. We can't let them reach the civilians." I understood what he was saying. If we retreated, innocent people would die. If we stayed and fought, we'd probably die. But we might buy time for passengers to escape toward the front of the train. It wasn't much of a choice, but it was the only moral option available. The firefight continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Tom moved with professional competence, making every shot count and coordinating our defensive positions with tactical precision. But the cleanup crew had military-grade weapons and unlimited ammunition, while we were armed with whatever Tom had been able to conceal during his undercover assignment. "I'm hit!" Tom gasped, pressing his hand against a wound in his shoulder that was bleeding through his tactical vest. "You need to get to the engine compartment. There's an emergency brake system that bypasses Captain Mills's controls." "I'm not leaving you here," I replied, though I could see more armed figures positioning themselves outside the car's windows. They were preparing for a coordinated assault that would overwhelm our defensive positions. "You don't have a choice," Tom said, and there was something in his voice that made me look at him more carefully. "There's something I haven't told you about this operation, about why I was chosen for the undercover assignment." The gunfire had temporarily stopped, which probably meant the cleanup crew was regrouping for their final assault. Tom used the lull to pull out a photograph from his tactical vest, showing a family I didn't recognize. A middle-aged couple with 2 teenage children, all smiling at the camera. "Vincent Torino killed my family 4 years ago," Tom said, his voice steady despite the blood loss and pain. "My wife, my daughter, my son. Made it look like a car accident, but I knew the truth. The FBI recruited me for this assignment because they knew I'd do whatever it took to bring him down." The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. Tom's willingness to commit murder during his undercover assignment, his intimate knowledge of Torino's operations, his decision to save me despite the risk to himself. This wasn't about law enforcement or justice. It was about revenge. "Tom, if you're not really FBI, if this is just personal—" "I am FBI," he interrupted, showing me credentials that looked genuine. "But you're right that it's personal. Sometimes the system needs people who are willing to cross lines that others won't cross. Sometimes justice requires methods that bureaucrats don't approve." The rear door of the dining car began to glow red-hot as someone applied cutting torches from the outside. The cleanup crew was preparing to breach our position with overwhelming force, and our time was measured in seconds rather than minutes. "The emergency brake," Tom repeated, pressing a keycard into my hand. "Engine compartment, red lever marked emergency override. Pull it, and the train will stop in about 2 miles, long enough for passengers to evacuate before we reach the mining facility. What about you?" But I already knew the answer. Tom was planning to hold off the cleanup crew while I escaped, a one-man delaying action that would probably cost him his life. "My family will be avenged," Tom said simply. "That's all that matters." The door exploded inward in a shower of sparks and molten metal. Tom opened fire immediately, his shots precise and deadly despite his wounds. I ran toward the front of the car as chaos erupted behind me, the sound of automatic weapons fire mixing with Tom's shouts of rage and pain. The passenger car was in full evacuation mode, with families moving toward the front of the train while conductors and staff tried to maintain order. I pushed through the crowd, Tom's key card clutched in my hand, trying to reach the engine compartment before the cleanup crew could regroup and pursue. The locomotive was a maze of controls and monitoring equipment, all operated by Captain Mills, who looked up in surprise when I burst through the door. He was a heavyset man in his 50s, with the kind of weathered face that came from decades of outdoor work, but his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who'd made peace with murder. "Mr. Castellanos," Captain Mills said calmly, not bothering to reach for a weapon. "You're supposed to be dead by now. That's going to create complications for everyone involved." "Stop this train," I demanded, Tom's key card ready to access the emergency brake system. "Stop it now, or I'll do it myself." Captain Mills laughed, a sound without humor or warmth. "You think pulling that lever will save anyone? We're 60 miles from the nearest town, in the middle of mountains filled with predators and winter weather. Even if passengers survive the evacuation, most of them will die of exposure before rescue arrives." He was probably right, but it was still better than the alternative. At least they'll have a chance. More than you gave the people in the business car. "Those people were threats to national security," Captain Mills replied, his tone suggesting he actually believed his own rationalization. "The Torino organization provides valuable intelligence services to agencies that can't operate through official channels. Sometimes protecting America requires sacrificing Americans." I activated Tom's key card and pulled the emergency brake lever. The train began to slow immediately, massive brake systems engaging with a sound like thunder. Captain Mills reached for his sidearm, but I was faster, Tom's backup weapon already in my hand. "Don't move," I ordered, though my hands were shaking with adrenaline and fear. "Keep your hands where I can see them." "Agent Brennan is dead," Captain Mills said conversationally. "My cleanup crew eliminated him 2 minutes ago, along with everyone else who might have overheard our conversation. You're the last witness, and when you're gone, the official story will be a tragic accident caused by mechanical failure." The train was slowing more rapidly now, the emergency brake system working exactly as Tom had promised. Through the locomotive's front window, I could see a straight section of track with relatively level ground on both sides. If passengers could evacuate quickly, some of them might survive until rescue teams arrived. "There won't be any rescue teams," Captain Mills continued, reading my thoughts with disturbing accuracy. "This train route has been temporarily closed for maintenance. No one is expecting us to arrive in Denver until tomorrow morning. By then, the evidence will be incinerated, and the witnesses will be frozen corpses scattered across 50 square miles of wilderness." The train was almost stopped now, but I could hear explosions from the passenger cars as the cleanup crew used military demolitions to create chaos and prevent organized evacuation. They weren't just planning to eliminate witnesses, they were planning to massacre everyone on board to make sure no one could testify about what they'd seen. "Why?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Why kill innocent families? Why murder people who have nothing to do with Vincent Torino or organized crime?" "Because innocent witnesses are still witnesses," Captain Mills replied with chilling logic. "Because in the intelligence business, there's no such thing as collateral damage that can't be rationalized as necessary sacrifice for the greater good." The train shuddered to a complete stop, and I could hear the cleanup crew coordinating through the passenger cars, probably checking for survivors and eliminating anyone they found. The window for evacuation was closing rapidly, and most passengers wouldn't understand the urgency of the situation. That's when I heard Tom's voice over the train's intercom system. "All passengers, this is FBI agent Tom Brennan. Evacuate the train immediately. Armed hostiles are aboard and will kill anyone they find. This is not a drill. Evacuate now and run toward the tree line. Do not stay on the train." Captain Mills drew his weapon, but Tom's warning had saved hundreds of lives. Through the locomotive windows, I could see families pouring out of the train cars and running toward the forest, carrying children and helping elderly passengers move as quickly as possible. "Agent Brennan is remarkably difficult to kill," Captain Mills observed, taking aim at my chest. "But you're not." The gunshot was deafeningly loud in the confined space of the locomotive, but Captain Mills was the one who fell, blood spreading across his engineer's uniform as Tom appeared in the doorway behind him, wounded but alive and still functional. "The cleanup crew?" I asked, helping Tom apply pressure to his shoulder wound. "Eliminated," Tom replied grimly. "All 12 of them. But there will be more at the mining facility, and they'll be expecting us when we don't arrive on schedule." Through the locomotive's radio, we could hear voices coordinating what sounded like a large-scale search and rescue operation. But the voices were speaking with accents that suggested foreign military units rather than American emergency responders. "Vincent Torino isn't just working with foreign governments," Tom said, monitoring the radio traffic with professional attention. "He's working for them. This entire operation is designed to eliminate American intelligence assets who were getting too close to enemy operations on our soil." The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Vincent Torino had been using his crime family as cover for espionage operations that reached into the highest levels of American law enforcement and intelligence agencies. The witnesses he'd been eliminating weren't just threats to his criminal enterprise, they were threats to enemy intelligence operations. "Tom, we need to get those passengers to safety and contact legitimate federal authorities, people who aren't compromised by foreign intelligence services," I was thinking about the families with children who were now hiding in the forest, probably freezing and terrified. There's something else, Tom said, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he'd been saving the worst revelation for last. Vincent Torino isn't the real leader of this organization. He's just a frontman, a criminal who was recruited to provide cover for operations planned and funded by people with much more sophisticated objectives. Who's the real leader? Tom pulled out a photograph that made my blood run cold. It showed a man I recognized from news broadcasts and congressional hearings, someone whose face was familiar to every American who followed political developments. Deputy Director of the FBI, James Crawford, Tom said. He's been using the Bureau's resources to coordinate assassinations of American intelligence officers who discovered evidence of foreign intelligence operations. Vincent Torino is just his enforcement arm. The implications were too enormous to process immediately. If the Deputy Director of the FBI was working for foreign intelligence services, then every aspect of American law enforcement and intelligence gathering had been compromised. The witnesses who'd been murdered weren't just threats to organized crime, they were threats to the most massive espionage operation in American history. The passengers, I said, though my mind was reeling from the scope of the conspiracy Tom had revealed. We need to get them to safety before Crawford's people find them. Tom was already moving toward the radio equipment, his wounded shoulder limiting his mobility, but not his determination. I'm calling in coordinates to the only federal agent I trust completely. Someone who's been investigating Crawford independently and gathering evidence about foreign intelligence operations in the FBI. Who? My handler from the undercover assignment. The person who recruited me after Vincent killed my family. Tom was working with communication equipment I didn't recognize, probably encrypted systems designed to bypass normal FBI monitoring. Deputy Director Jennifer Kane, FBI Internal Affairs Division. The radio crackled with a response that sounded like military coordination. Agent Brennan, we have your location and are dispatching tactical units immediately. Extraction for civilian evacuation in 30 minutes. Hold your position and protect witnesses until arrival. Through the locomotive's windows, I could see helicopters approaching from the east, flying with the formation discipline of military aircraft rather than civilian rescue units. But whether they were friendly forces or additional cleanup crews was impossible to determine from this distance. Tom, how do we know we can trust Deputy Director Kane? If Crawford has been operating inside the FBI for years, he could have compromised other high-ranking officials. Tom was checking his weapon and inventorying the ammunition we had remaining. Because Jennifer Kane is my sister. She recruited me for this assignment specifically because she knew I'd be willing to do whatever it took to bring down the people who killed my family. Everything clicked into place with horrible clarity. Tom's knowledge of FBI procedures, his access to undercover assignments, his willingness to commit murder during his infiltration of Vincent's organization. He wasn't just an agent seeking justice. He was part of a family crusade against the people who'd destroyed their lives. Jennifer discovered the foreign intelligence operations 18 months ago, but she needed evidence that could only be gathered from inside Vincent's organization. Evidence that required someone willing to become a killer in order to maintain cover credentials. The helicopters were landing now, disgorging tactical teams that moved with professional military precision. Through binoculars, I could see FBI markings on their equipment and uniforms that looked legitimate. But after everything we'd discovered, appearances meant nothing. How do we verify they're really federal agents and not more cleanup crews? I asked, watching the tactical teams coordinate their approach to our position. Tom pulled out a device that looked like a military communication radio. Jennifer gave me authentication codes that only she knows. If these are her people, they'll respond correctly. If they're not, he activated the device and spoke in what sounded like code. Blue Sky requesting authentication for Operation Lighthouse. Confirm your authorization level and operational command structure. The response came immediately through the same device. Blue Sky authenticated. Operation Lighthouse confirmed. Deputy Director Kane sends familial regards and requests immediate confirmation of witness status and evidence security. Tom's relief was visible, but he kept his weapon ready. They're legitimate. Jennifer's people, operating under direct authority from FBI headquarters. But we need to move fast. Crawford's people will be coordinating their own response, and they have resources we can't match. The tactical teams reached our position within minutes, professional and efficient in evacuating Tom and me from the locomotive, while other units coordinated passenger rescue operations in the forest. The families who'd fled the train were being loaded into military transport helicopters, while medical teams treated injuries and exposure. Agent Brennan, the team leader said, helping support Tom's wounded shoulder. Deputy Director Kane requests immediate debriefing on Vincent Torino's operations, and Deputy Director Crawford's involvement in foreign intelligence activities. The evidence is in Agent Castellanos' briefcase, Tom replied, gesturing toward the financial records I'd been carrying to the Denver hearing. 18 months of investigation into money laundering operations that connect Vincent's organization to Russian, Chinese, and Iranian intelligence services. As we were loaded into a medical helicopter, I could see the cleanup crew's bodies being processed by FBI forensic teams, while explosive ordnance disposal units checked the train for additional booby traps or chemical weapons. The scope of the operation was massive, suggesting that Crawford's conspiracy had been under federal investigation for months or years. What happens now? I asked Tom, as medical personnel treated his gunshot wounds and the helicopter lifted off toward what appeared to be a military base in the distance. "Now we testify," Tom replied, his voice steady despite the pain medication and blood loss. Jennifer has been building a case against Crawford and his foreign intelligence contacts, but she needed witnesses and evidence that could survive legal challenges. What happened on this train provides both. The helicopter was flying toward Denver, but instead of heading to a civilian hospital or FBI field office, we were approaching what looked like a federal courthouse with extensive security perimeters and military protection. Deputy Director Kane was apparently taking no chances with witness security or evidence preservation. The Torino hearing is still scheduled for Monday, I realized. If Crawford is arrested and his conspiracy exposed, Vincent becomes a small fish in a much larger investigation. Vincent won't survive to see trial, Tom said with grim certainty. He knows too much about Crawford's operations and foreign intelligence contacts. Either Crawford's people will eliminate him, or his foreign handlers will, or he'll be killed in federal custody by other prisoners who've been paid to silence him. The helicopter was landing now, on what appeared to be the roof of a federal building surrounded by tactical teams and communication equipment. Deputy Director Jennifer Kane was waiting personally, a tall woman in her 40s with Tom's eyes and the same determined expression I'd seen on his face throughout our ordeal. "Agent Brennan," she said, helping him down from the helicopter despite his protests that he could walk unassisted. "Medical attention first, debriefing second. We have time to do this properly." "The witnesses from the train," I said. "The families with children. Are they safe?" "All evacuated successfully," Deputy Director Kane confirmed. "Medical treatment for exposure, psychological counseling for trauma, witness protection for anyone who saw the cleanup crew's faces or heard their communications. No one will be left vulnerable to Crawford's retaliation." As we were escorted into the federal building, I could see news vans and reporters gathering outside the security perimeter. The story was already breaking. FBI Deputy Director arrested for espionage, conspiracy exposed involving foreign intelligence services, federal agents killed in the line of duty while protecting witnesses. "Agent Castellanos," Deputy Director Kane said as we entered what appeared to be a secure briefing room, "your financial investigation of Vincent Torino has provided the foundation for exposing the largest foreign intelligence operation in American history. Without your work, we might never have discovered the scope of Crawford's betrayal." 6 months later, I testified before a joint congressional committee about the systematic use of organized crime families as cover for foreign intelligence operations against American targets. Deputy Director Crawford was sentenced to life in prison for treason, espionage, and the murders of 17 federal agents. Vincent Torino died in federal custody before trial, killed by another prisoner who was later discovered to be a Russian intelligence asset. Tom received the FBI's highest honor for his undercover work and sacrifice in exposing the conspiracy. But he retired from federal service to spend time with the families of agents who'd been killed during Crawford's operations. Sometimes justice requires personal costs that can't be measured in official commendations or legal victories, and Tom understood that better than most.